The small town of Riverbend rested at the edge of sprawling forests and quiet, rolling hills, its charm rooted in simplicity. The heart of this town was the Riverbend Diner, a cozy spot where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling burgers greeted anyone who walked in. Seated in his usual corner booth, 17-year-old Ryan Matthews gazed out the window. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in a warm, golden hue. The diner was bustling, yet peaceful, locals chatting about high school football games, upcoming church potlucks, and town council meetings. Ryan wasn't your average teenager. He was lean but strong, with sharp green eyes that seemed to notice everything. Though quiet and reserved, he was well known for volunteering at the town's youth center, teaching kids self-defense and guiding them away from trouble. On his jacket's lapel was a small insignia, a tribute to his late father, a Marine who had passed away in the line of duty. "Here you go, Ryan," said Mary Jensen, the diner's waitress and part-time manager. She placed a cheeseburger and fries in front of him, her smile warm and maternal. "You're always working hard. You deserve a good meal." Ryan smiled softly. "Thanks, Mary. How's Tim doing?" Mary beamed at the mention of her son, one of the kids Ryan mentored at the youth center. "He's been practicing that move you showed him. Says he feels like a ninja now." Ryan chuckled, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps and the low growl of motorcycle engines outside. The door to the diner swung open, and 5 men stepped in. Their leather jackets bore the emblem of the Iron Fangs, a notorious motorcycle gang known for their rough behavior and petty crimes. Their leader, Blake "Steel" Carson, towered over the rest, a broad, intimidating figure with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly. Conversations hushed, and people avoided eye contact with the gang. Blake scanned the room, his lips curling into a smirk. Well, isn't this a quaint little place?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Ryan kept his gaze steady but remained seated, observing the group with quiet vigilance. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the bikers sneered at Mary, deliberately knocking over a napkin holder. "Why don't you get us some coffee? Black. And hurry up." Mary stiffened but nodded, trying to avoid conflict. Nearby, a young father sat with his 6-year-old daughter. The little girl clutched her stuffed bear as she glanced nervously at the bikers. Blake noticed her and sauntered over. "Cute kid," he said, his tone unnerving. "How about a high five, huh?" The father shifted uncomfortably. "Please, just leave us alone." Blake leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I wasn't asking." Ryan stood. His movement was calm, deliberate. He said to leave them alone. The diner fell silent. Blake turned to face Ryan, his smirk faltering slightly. "And who the hell are you? Some kid who thinks he's a hero?" Ryan didn't flinch. "Just someone who knows when enough is enough." Blake's eyes narrowed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't get you far when you're outnumbered." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, lunged toward Ryan. His movements were clumsy, telegraphed. Ryan stepped aside smoothly, redirecting the man's momentum and sending him sprawling into a booth. Plates clattered to the floor. Blake roared, pulling out a pair of brass knuckles. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." The gang leader swung at Ryan with brute force, but Ryan ducked, his reflexes sharp. He swept Blake's legs out from under him, sending the large man crashing to the ground. 2 more bikers charged. Ryan sidestepped the first, landing a precise jab to the ribs. The second tried to grab him, but Ryan countered with a sharp elbow to the stomach, leaving him doubled over. The 5th biker hesitated, glancing nervously at his fallen comrades. He took a step back, then bolted out the door. Blake struggled to his feet, his bravado gone. "You're gonna pay for this, kid," he snarled, wiping blood from his split lip. Ryan's voice was steady. "Not if you know what's good for you." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and Blake's sneer turned into a scowl. "Let's go," he barked at his crew. The bikers limped out as the sheriff's patrol car pulled into the lot. Ryan turned to the young father and his daughter, who were huddled in a corner. "It's okay now," he said gently. "They won't bother you again." Mary approached, her hands trembling but her eyes filled with gratitude. "Ryan, You didn't have to. Yes, I did, Ryan said simply. By the time the police had taken statements and cleared the scene, Ryan was back in his booth, quietly finishing his meal. Unbeknownst to him, a diner patron had recorded the entire confrontation. The next morning, the video would go viral, catapulting Ryan into an unwanted spotlight and setting in motion a series of events that would change the town and his life forever. The morning after the confrontation at the diner, Ryan Matthews awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was Maggie or someone from the youth center, but the notifications didn't stop. Groaning, he reached for his phone and squinted at the screen. Social media apps were flooded with tags, mentions, and messages. His name was trending. Confused, Ryan clicked on the first link. A video popped up, showing the events at the diner from the previous night. The recording, taken from an angle near the counter, captured the moment Ryan had stood up to Blake Carson and the Iron Fangs. The title read, "Teenager Defends Town from Notorious Gang." Ryan groaned. Oh no. His phone rang. It was Maggie. "Ryan, have you seen it?" she asked, her voice excited and panicked at the same time. "Seen what?" he asked, though he already knew. "You're a hero. Everyone's talking about you. The video has over 1 million views already. News outlets are sharing it. Even local TV stations are calling you the hero of Riverbend." "I didn't do it for attention," Ryan muttered. "Yeah, well, you got it anyway," Maggie replied. "You better get down to the youth center. People are starting to show up asking about you." Ryan's walk to the youth center was uneventful, but the moment he stepped inside, he was met with applause. The kids he trained cheered, and some of the younger ones ran up to hug him. "Ryan, you're famous now," shouted Tim, one of his students. "Knock it off," Ryan said with an awkward smile, ruffling the boy's hair. The youth center was busier than Ryan had ever seen it. Local residents were dropping off donations, sports equipment, snacks, books, and even cash. A group of older veterans from a nearby town stood in the corner, talking to the youth center's director, Mrs. Avery. "Ryan," Mrs. Avery called out, her voice filled with warmth. "Come here for a second." He approached, feeling out of place. "These gentlemen are from the local VFW," she explained. "They saw the video and wanted to help." One of the men, an older veteran named Mr. Foster, shook Ryan's hand firmly. "Your father would have been proud, son. What you did at that diner took guts. We'd like to support the work you're doing here. Count on us for supplies, mentorship programs, anything you need." Ryan was touched but also overwhelmed. "Thank you, sir. But I just did what anyone should have done." "Not everyone has the courage to stand up," Mr. Foster replied, clapping him on the shoulder. Meanwhile, in a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town, the Iron Fangs were nursing their wounds. Blake Carson sat at a makeshift table, his arm wrapped in a sling and his face dark with rage. "That little punk made us look like fools," Blake growled, slamming his good fist on the table. One of his men, Snake, the wiry man with the tattooed neck, spoke up nervously. "The cops are all over town now. We can't just waltz in and take him out." Blake's eyes burned with fury. "I don't care. That kid embarrassed us. He's made us a joke. We need to remind this town who runs things." "What's the plan?" another gang member asked. Blake leaned back, a sinister smile forming. "We're going to hit them where it hurts. The youth center. That's his soft spot. If we can't get to him directly, we'll send a message through the people he cares about." Back at the youth center, Ryan was finishing a self-defense class when Maggie walked in, holding her phone. "You're going to want to see this," she said, handing it to him. On the screen was a news report. The Iron Fangs were suspected of vandalizing a community park in the next town over. Graffiti, smashed equipment, and threats spray-painted on walls. "It's only a matter of time before they try something here," Maggie said, her voice low. Ryan nodded grimly. "We need to be ready." That evening, Ryan met with Mrs. Avery and a few community leaders, including Sheriff Tom Reed. Sheriff Reed was a tall, grizzled man in his late 40s who had known Ryan since he was a boy. "Ryan, I admire what you did," the sheriff began. "But you're just a teenager. It's not your job to take on these guys." "I'm not looking for trouble," Ryan replied. "But I can't stand by if they hurt people." They're not going to stop unless someone stands up to them. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. I'll increase patrols around the youth center and the diner, but you need to be careful. These guys don't play fair. A week later, just as things seemed to settle down, the Iron Fangs made their move. Late one night, they spray-painted threats on the walls of the youth center and smashed windows. Ryan arrived the next morning to find the damage. Kids and volunteers stood outside, shocked and disheartened. Mrs. Avery shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. They're trying to scare us, Ryan said, stepping forward. But we're not going to back down. We'll fix this. Word spread quickly, and within hours, the community rallied. Volunteers arrived with supplies to repaint the walls and repair the broken windows. Local businesses donated money to cover the costs. Ryan led the effort, organizing the repairs and encouraging the kids to see it as a lesson in resilience. When bullies try to knock you down, he told them, you get back up, stronger than before. The video of Ryan's stand at the diner continued to gain traction, and the vandalism incident only brought more attention. Messages of support poured in from across the country. Veterans groups began visiting Riverbend, offering mentorship programs at the youth center. Local businesses pledged funding. Even rival motorcycle clubs reached out, offering to help protect the town from the Iron Fangs. Ryan, though reluctant to be in the spotlight, couldn't deny the good that was coming from it. This isn't about me, he told Maggie one afternoon. It's about what we can do when we come together. In the shadows, Blake Carson seethed. The Iron Fang's hold on Riverbend was slipping, and the town's defiance only fueled his anger. We're not done, Blake growled to his crew. If they think they can beat us, they're in for a rude awakening. As the chapter ends, a chilling sense of foreboding looms over Riverbend. While the community grows stronger, the Iron Fangs prepare for their next, more dangerous move. Ryan Matthews stood at the youth center's cracked basketball court, gazing out at the line of kids trying to perfect the self-defense techniques he'd been teaching. Though the early evening sun cast a warm glow over Riverbend, Ryan couldn't shake the tension building in his chest. The vandalism from the Iron Fangs still loomed over the youth center like a dark cloud. Even though the community had repaired the damage, Ryan knew the gang wasn't finished. Their message was clear. They were coming back. Ryan. Maggie's voice broke through his thoughts. She jogged across the court, her phone in hand. Her dark hair bounced as she moved, her face a mix of excitement and concern. Another video? Ryan asked dryly. No, not this time, she replied, catching her breath. But you should hear this. Sheriff Reed called a meeting tonight. He wants you to come. Ryan frowned. What for? Probably to warn you. Again. Maggie crossed her arms. You know he's not thrilled about you standing up to the Iron Fangs. Ryan sighed. I'll go. But if they think I'm just going to step aside, they're wrong. That evening, Ryan entered the town hall. The room was filled with concerned citizens, local business owners, and a few faces he recognized from the diner incident. Sheriff Reed stood at the front, his hands on his hips, his face serious. Thank you all for coming, the sheriff began, his voice heavy. The Iron Fangs have been causing trouble in this town for years. But lately, they've escalated. Last week's vandalism at the youth center was just the beginning. Ryan watched as the sheriff scanned the crowd. When their eyes met, Reed's expression softened slightly. These men aren't just your typical gang, Reed continued. They're organized, and they've been linked to theft, extortion, and worse in neighboring towns. If we want to get rid of them for good, we need evidence to bring to the DA. An older man raised his hand. Sheriff, what about that boy? Ryan Matthews? He stood up to them once. Isn't that proof enough they don't control this town? The sheriff sighed. Ryan's actions were brave. But we can't rely on one teenager to handle this. The law has to take its course. Ryan felt the weight of the room's eyes on him. He stood, his voice calm but firm. I'm not trying to fight them for glory or attention. I just want this town, and the people in it, to feel safe. But you're right, Sheriff. This isn't just my fight. It's all of ours. The room murmured in agreement. Sheriff Reed gave Ryan a small nod, but there was still doubt in his eyes. Later that night, as Ryan walked home, a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley. Instinctively, Ryan's body tensed, ready to defend himself. "Easy, kid," the man said, holding his hands up. Ryan took a closer look. The man was in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and weary eyes. His leather jacket bore faint traces of the Iron Fangs emblem, partially torn away. "Who are you?" Ryan asked warily. "Nate Parker," the man replied. "I used to ride with the Iron Fangs." "Not anymore." Ryan's gaze narrowed. "What do you want?" "I want to help," Nate said. "I saw what you did at the diner. You've got guts, kid, but you're playing a dangerous game. Blake doesn't just forget things like that." Ryan crossed his arms. "Why should I trust you?" Nate hesitated, then pulled a worn photograph from his pocket. It showed a young boy, about 10 years old, smiling up at the camera. "This is my son. He lives with his mom now, far away from this mess. I want to be someone he can be proud of again. But I need to make things right first." Ryan studied Nate's face. There was sincerity there, but also pain. Pain that mirrored some of his own. "What do you know about Blake's plans?" "Enough to know he's planning something big," Nate replied. "Blake doesn't take humiliation lightly. He'll go after the youth center again, or worse. But if you're willing to listen, I can help you stop him." The next morning, Ryan met Nate at the edge of the woods near the youth center. They sat on a fallen log as Nate began to explain the Iron Fang structure. "Blake runs the gang like a military unit," Nate said. "He used to be a soldier. Army, I think. But when he came back, he couldn't adjust. The gang gave him purpose, but it also turned him into something darker." Ryan nodded. "And the others? Are they just like him?" "Not all of them," Nate admitted. "Most of the guys are just lost. Kids who never had a chance, or guys like me who made the wrong choices. Blake keeps them in line with fear and loyalty. But if you take him down, the rest will scatter." Ryan's mind raced. He thought of his father, who had also served in the military but had never let the darkness consume him. If Blake's a soldier, then he has a plan. What's his next move? Nate's expression darkened. "He's going to make an example out of you in the youth center. That's how he keeps control, by showing no one can defy him." Ryan knew he couldn't wait for the Iron Fangs to strike again. That afternoon, he called a meeting at the youth center. Maggie, Sheriff Reed, and Mrs. Avery sat with him, along with a few local veterans who had become regular volunteers. "Blake's coming for us," Ryan began. "We can't let him scare us into silence. We need to be ready." Sheriff Reed frowned. "Ryan, I don't want to see anyone get hurt. Let me handle this." "With all due respect, Sheriff, you can't be everywhere at once," Ryan replied. "But we can be smart about this. We'll focus on protecting the youth center and gathering evidence to shut them down for good." The veterans nodded in agreement. "We've seen worse in our time," Mr. Foster said. "We can help set up a watch and keep the kids safe." Sheriff Reed sighed but relented. "Fine, but the moment things get out of hand, you call me. Understood?" Ryan nodded. Understood. As the meeting dispersed, Ryan stood alone on the basketball court, staring into the horizon. Maggie approached, her voice soft. "Do you really think we can stop them?" "We don't have a choice," Ryan replied. "If we don't stand up to them now, they'll keep coming." Maggie placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay?" Ryan managed a small smile. "I promise." But as the sun dipped below the trees, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only beginning. Riverbend awoke to a cool morning, the crisp air laced with the faint scent of autumn leaves. The youth center bustled with activity, the sound of laughter and chatter filling the air as kids played basketball, painted murals, and participated in self-defense lessons led by Ryan Matthews. Despite the recent vandalism by the Iron Fangs, the center remained a hub of hope and community. Ryan stood near the edge of the court, watching a group of younger kids practice the defensive moves he'd taught them. Tim, one of the more enthusiastic kids, mimicked Ryan's posture with exaggerated precision, drawing a quiet smile from his mentor. But Ryan's mind was elsewhere. The Iron Fangs weren't gone. They were regrouping, planning their next move, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they struck again. Nate Parker's warning echoed in his mind. Blake Carson didn't forgive or forget. As the afternoon wore on, Maggie Lopez arrived, her arms full of flyers. "We're getting good traction," she said, dropping the stack onto a nearby table. I've been handing these out all over town. Ryan picked one up. It was an invitation to a community rally at the youth center, an event meant to bring the town together and send a message to the Iron Fangs that Riverbend wouldn't be intimidated. The bold title read, "Stand Together, Stronger Together." "Do you really think this will work?" Ryan asked, scanning the flyer. "It has to," Maggie said. "If we show them we're united, they'll think twice about coming after us again." Ryan nodded, though his doubts lingered. The Iron Fangs weren't the kind to back down easily, and unity alone wouldn't stop them if they decided to escalate. Later that evening, Ryan helped set up for the rally. Volunteers hung string lights across the youth center's courtyard, set up tables with snacks and drinks, and arranged chairs for the expected crowd. The event felt hopeful, almost celebratory, but Ryan couldn't shake the weight in his chest. He caught sight of Nate lingering near the edge of the courtyard, watching the preparations with a guarded expression. "You sure this is a good idea?" Nate asked as Ryan approached him. "It's better than doing nothing," Ryan replied. "Maybe," Nate said, his voice low. "But Blake doesn't care about unity or community. He only understands power." Ryan folded his arms. "Then we show him that the power isn't his anymore." As the sun dipped below the horizon, people began arriving. Families, local business owners, veterans, and students from the high school trickled in, filling the courtyard with a warmth that contrasted the cool night air. Ryan moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging smiles, but his eyes constantly scanned for any signs of trouble. Sheriff Reed stood near the entrance, his presence a silent reassurance to the attendees. The rally began with speeches from community leaders, each one emphasizing the importance of standing together in the face of fear. Mrs. Avery spoke about the youth center's mission, her voice trembling with emotion as she described how much it meant to the town. Maggie followed, her fiery determination earning cheers from the crowd. Finally, Ryan stepped onto the makeshift stage. The chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He wasn't used to speaking in front of large groups, but tonight, he couldn't afford to stay silent. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I'm just a kid who got tired of seeing people get hurt. The Iron Fangs think they can scare us into submission, but they're wrong. This town is stronger than that. You're stronger than that." The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment, Ryan felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. As the rally continued, Ryan allowed himself a brief moment of hope. The unity on display was powerful, and it was hard not to feel that maybe, just maybe, they were making progress. But his optimism was short-lived. A loud crack shattered the evening's calm, followed by the dull roar of approaching motorcycles. The crowd froze, their heads turning toward the street as the Iron Fangs rolled into view, their engines rumbling like a distant storm. Blake Carson led the group, his eyes cold and menacing. He dismounted his bike and walked toward the courtyard, the other gang members following close behind. The once cheerful atmosphere dissolved into tension, the air thick with fear. "Nice little party you've got here," Blake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But it looks like you forgot to invite the guests of honor." Sheriff Reed stepped forward, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. "That's far enough, Blake," he said firmly. "You're trespassing." Blake smirked. "Oh, I'm just here to talk, Sheriff. No need to get all worked up." Ryan stepped out of the crowd, his heart pounding but his stance steady. "You've done enough talking, Blake. Leave." Blake's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You think you're tough, don't you, kid? Standing up to me, embarrassing my crew. But you don't understand how this works. I run this town. Not you, not them." He gestured toward the crowd. "You don't run anything," Ryan said, his voice calm but unwavering. "The only power you have is the power people let you take. And we're not letting you take it anymore." The tension reached a breaking point. Blake's sneer twisted into a snarl, and he lunged toward Ryan. But before he could close the distance, the crowd surged forward. Veterans, parents, and even teenagers stepped between Ryan and the gang, forming a human barrier. "You're not welcome here," Mrs. Avery said, her voice trembling but resolute. Blake hesitated, his confidence faltering as he realized the sheer number of people standing against him. "This isn't over," he growled, backing away. "You'll regret this." The gang mounted their bikes and roared off into the night, leaving a shaken but defiant crowd in their wake. As the event slowly wound down, Sheriff Reed approached Ryan. "You're playing a dangerous game, son," he said. "I know," Ryan replied, "but it's not a game to me." The sheriff nodded, his expression softening. "Just be careful. These guys don't fight fair." As Ryan helped clean up the courtyard, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just happened. The town had stood together tonight, but the Iron Fangs weren't done. They'd be back, and next time, it would be worse. For now, though, Ryan allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fight wasn't over, but neither was their resolve. The sun hung low in the sky as Ryan Matthews sat on the edge of the youth center's basketball court, staring at the horizon. The events of the rally lingered in his mind like a storm cloud. The Iron Fangs had been driven away for now, but their leader, Blake Carson, wasn't one to take defeat quietly. Nate's warning had been clear. The gang would retaliate, and when they did, it would be ruthless. Maggie approached, a water bottle in hand. She dropped onto the bench beside him, her presence familiar and grounding. "You've been quiet since the rally," she said. Ryan shrugged. "Just thinking." "About Blake?" Ryan nodded. "They're not done, Maggie. We stopped them once, but they'll come back harder. I need to be ready." Maggie placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. The whole town is behind you." "That's what I'm afraid of," Ryan admitted. "If they can't get to me, they'll go after the people I care about." The retaliation came faster than Ryan expected. 2 days after the rally, Maggie was walking home from the library, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her headphones in. She didn't notice the motorcycle engine roaring behind her until it was too late. Snake, one of Blake's most loyal men, skidded his bike to a stop in front of her, blocking the sidewalk. His grin was predatory, his tattooed neck glinting in the streetlight. Well, look who we have here," he sneered. Maggie froze, her heart pounding. She took a step back, but another biker appeared behind her, cutting off her escape. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, nothing much," Snake said, dismounting his bike. "Just a little message for your friend Ryan. Tell him we don't appreciate his little show at the rally. And if he keeps playing hero, the next time we come calling, it won't just be a warning." Maggie's hand tightened around her phone. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, when a familiar voice cut through the night. "Let her go." Ryan stepped into the light, his fists clenched and his jaw set. His eyes locked on Snake, unflinching. Snake laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Look who decided to join us. You really think you can take all of us, kid?" Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he moved with precision, closing the distance between them before Snake could react. In a blur, Ryan grabbed Snake's arm, twisting it and forcing the biker to the ground. The second biker lunged, but Ryan sidestepped him, delivering a sharp elbow to the ribs. The fight was over in seconds. Snake scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, and glared at Ryan. "You just made a big mistake, kid," he snarled. "Blake's gonna hear about this." "Good," Ryan said. "And you can tell him that if he touches anyone in this town again, he'll regret it." The bikers mounted their motorcycles and sped off into the night, their threats echoing in the air. Ryan turned to Maggie, who was visibly shaken but unharmed. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice shaky. "Yeah, thanks to you." The next morning, the youth center was quiet. The kids were busy with their activities, but Ryan's focus was elsewhere. He sat in the office with Nate Parker, who had become an unlikely ally in the fight against the Iron Fangs. "You need to be careful," Nate said, his tone serious. "Blake's not going to take this lightly. He's dangerous when he feels cornered." "I know," Ryan replied, "but I'm not backing down. Not now." Nate sighed. "There's something you should know about Blake. He's not just some thug. He served in the army, same as your dad. But when he came back, he couldn't handle civilian life. He started the gang to feel like he was in control again." Ryan's jaw tightened. "That doesn't excuse what he's done." "No, it doesn't," Nate agreed. "But it means he's not going to stop unless someone forces him to. And that someone might have to be you." Over the next few days, Ryan worked tirelessly to prepare for whatever Blake had planned. He coordinated with Sheriff Reed to increase patrols around the youth center and the diner. He also doubled down on self-defense lessons, teaching the kids how to protect themselves without escalating a confrontation. But the stress was taking its toll. Ryan barely slept, his mind constantly racing with worst-case scenarios. Maggie noticed the change in him and tried to intervene. "You're burning yourself out," she said one evening as they sat in the diner. "You can't carry all of this on your own." Ryan sighed. "I don't have a choice. If I don't, who will?" "We will," Maggie said firmly. "Me, the town, Nate, Sheriff Reed. We're all in this together. You don't have to be the only one standing against them." Her words gave him pause. For so long, Ryan had felt like the weight of the town's safety rested solely on his shoulders. But Maggie was right. He wasn't alone. That realization came into sharp focus the next night, when Blake Carson himself walked into the youth center. He wasn't alone. Two of his men flanked him, their expressions cold and unyielding. The room fell silent as Blake's boots echoed on the polished floor. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his tone mocking. "Shame if something happened to it." Ryan stepped forward, his heart pounding but his face calm. "What do you want, Blake?" Blake smirked. "Just a little chat. You've been making my life difficult lately. Thought I'd return the favor." "This isn't your town," Ryan said. "It doesn't belong to you." Blake's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Maybe not. But people like me? We survive because we take what we want. People like you? You die trying to protect things that don't matter." Ryan's fists clenched at his sides. "This town matters. These people matter. And you're not going to hurt them." Blake took a step closer, his voice dropping. "We'll see about that." As the gang left, the tension in the room slowly eased, but the message was clear. Blake wasn't backing down, and neither was Ryan. But for the first time, Ryan wasn't sure if he could win this fight. The air in Riverbend felt heavy in the days following Blake Carson's visit to the youth center. His words echoed in Ryan's mind, a warning laced with menace. It was clear that the Iron Fangs weren't just threatening. They were planning something bigger. For the first time, Ryan wondered if he was in over his head. Despite his doubts, Ryan pressed forward. The youth center became the town's rallying point, with volunteers coming in daily to help with programs, repairs, and community activities. The energy was hopeful, but underneath it all was an unspoken fear that the Iron Fangs would strike again. The tension came to a head on a crisp Saturday morning. Ryan was working with Tim and a group of kids, showing them how to properly maintain the donated bicycles they'd been repairing for neighborhood families. Maggie was organizing the supplies nearby, her usual cheerful demeanor tempered by the seriousness of the situation. Nate Parker arrived just before noon, his face pale and grim. He pulled Ryan aside, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "What's going on?" Ryan asked, already sensing the urgency. "It's Blake," Nate said. "He's planning something big, something he thinks will break this town for good." Ryan's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Nate hesitated before answering. "He's going to burn the youth center down. He thinks if he destroys the place you care about most, the town will stop rallying behind you." Ryan's fists clenched at his sides. "When?" "Tonight," Nate said. "I overheard them talking about it at their hideout. They're bringing enough gasoline to light up the whole block." That evening, Ryan called an emergency meeting at the youth center. Sheriff Reed, Mrs. Avery, Maggie, and several other community leaders gathered in the main hall, their faces tense as Ryan relayed Nate's warning. "We can't let this happen," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "This place means too much to the town. If we lose it, we lose everything we've worked for." Sheriff Reed nodded, his jaw tight. "I've already got deputies patrolling the area, but if Blake and his men are determined, they'll find a way to slip through. We'll need more than just a police presence." "What do you suggest?" Mrs. Avery asked. "We defend it," Ryan said. "We show them that this town isn't afraid of them." Maggie frowned. "Ryan, that's risky. If they're armed." "I know it's risky," Ryan interrupted, "but we can't let them win. We'll do this smart. No violence, no escalation. We hold the line, and we call the sheriff the moment anything happens." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. Finally, Nate spoke. "I'll help. I know how they think. If we're going to stop them, you'll need someone who can predict their moves." Sheriff Reed gave Nate a wary look. "You better not be leading us into a trap." "I'm not," Nate said firmly. "I left that life behind, and I want to make sure no one else gets hurt because of Blake's stupidity." As night fell, the youth center became a fortress of quiet resolve. Volunteers, veterans, and parents took up watchful positions around the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Sheriff Reed and his deputies parked their patrol cars nearby, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Ryan stood at the main entrance, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Maggie stood beside him, her arms crossed against the chill. "This feels like something out of a movie," she said, her voice light but tinged with nerves. "Not one I'd choose to star in," Ryan replied. A sudden noise, a low rumble of motorcycles in the distance, sent a ripple of tension through the group. The Iron Fangs were coming. The gang arrived just after midnight, their engines cutting out as they parked their bikes in a semicircle around the youth center. Blake Carson stepped forward, flanked by Snake and two other gang members. Each carried a jerrycan of gasoline, their intentions unmistakable. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Blake sneered, taking in the gathered crowd. "Looks like you brought the whole town out to play." Ryan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This ends tonight, Blake. You're not burning anything down." Blake chuckled darkly. "You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But guts won't stop fire." The gang spread out, their movements calculated. Ryan felt his muscles tense, but he kept his stance relaxed. "You can still walk away from this," he said. "No one has to get hurt." Blake's smirk twisted into a scowl. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the building. It's about sending a message. I run this town, and anyone who thinks otherwise needs to learn the hard way." Ryan took a step closer. "You don't run anything, Blake. All you do is destroy. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can choose something better." For a moment, Blake hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "Nice speech, kid. Too bad it's wasted on me." He motioned to his men, who began uncapping the jerrycans. "Stop!" Ryan shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "The sheriff's already here. You take one step closer, and you'll all be in cuffs before the first match is struck." Blake froze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the patrol cars hidden in the shadows. Sheriff Reed stepped into the light, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "It's over, Blake," the sheriff said. "Drop the gas cans and get on the ground. Now." The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering. But Blake wasn't ready to give up. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "I'll be back. You can't keep me down forever." "Maybe not," Ryan said, "but you can't scare us anymore. This town won't let you." Blake glared at Ryan, then at the gathered crowd. Finally, he threw the gas can to the ground and raised his hands in surrender. One by one, the other gang members followed suit. By dawn, the Iron Fangs were in custody, their bikes impounded and their reign of terror effectively ended. The town gathered at the youth center to celebrate, their relief palpable. Ryan stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the kids played on the basketball court and parents exchanged hugs. Maggie joined him, a smile tugging at her lips. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Ryan corrected. As the sun rose higher, Sheriff Reed approached, his expression softer than Ryan had ever seen. "You did good, kid," he said. "But next time, leave the law enforcement to me, all right?" Ryan chuckled. "I'll try." The morning air was filled with laughter and chatter, but Ryan's thoughts lingered on Blake. The gang leader had been taken away in handcuffs, but his parting words still echoed in Ryan's mind. This wasn't just a victory for the youth center or the town. It was a step towards something bigger: redemption, change, and unity. And for the first time, Ryan felt like it was possible. The days following the Iron Fang's capture brought an uneasy calm to Riverbend. The youth center buzzed with renewed energy as volunteers and townspeople worked to repair lingering damage and celebrate their victory. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the town could finally breathe. But Ryan Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Blake Carson had been arrested, but he wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat easily. Ryan knew the Iron Fang's leader would find a way to retaliate, even from behind bars. His instincts proved correct when Nate Parker rushed into the youth center one afternoon, his face pale and his words urgent. "Blake's out," Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan froze. "What do you mean he's out?" "The sheriff said they had enough to hold him." Nate shook his head. "One of his crew must have pulled strings. Rumor is they're regrouping. Blake's furious, and he's not going to play games this time. He wants to end this, for good." Ryan felt a chill run through him. The town had united to face the Iron Fangs once, but if Blake was back, he wouldn't just try to scare them. This time, he'd aim to destroy everything they'd built. That evening, Ryan met with Sheriff Reed, Maggie, and a few trusted community members at the diner. The atmosphere was tense, the usual hum of the diner replaced with quiet murmurs and worried glances. "We can't let Blake take back control," Ryan said, his voice firm. "If we don't act, he'll come after the youth center again, or worse." Sheriff Reed nodded, his brow furrowed. "I've already got deputies watching his usual haunts, but Blake's slippery. If he's out for revenge, he'll be careful." "What about the rest of his crew?" Maggie asked. "Most of them are still locked up," the sheriff replied. "But Blake's got enough loyalists to make trouble. We need to figure out what he's planning and shut it down before it starts." Nate leaned forward, his expression grim. "Blake's not going to hit the youth center again. That'd be too predictable. He'll want something bigger, something that'll send a message to the whole town." The table fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Ryan broke the quiet. "Then we don't wait for him to strike. We take the fight to him." Maggie's eyes widened. "Ryan, are you serious? That's dangerous." "I'm not saying we fight him head-on," Ryan clarified. "But if we can figure out where he's regrouping and what he's planning, we can stop it before it starts." Sheriff Reed sighed. "It's risky, but it's the best shot we've got." "Nate, you still know where Blake might go?" "There's an old warehouse on the edge of town," Nate said. "Blake used it as a meeting spot before. If he's back, that's where he'll be." The days following the Iron Fang's capture brought an uneasy calm to Riverbend. The youth center buzzed with renewed energy as volunteers and townspeople worked to repair lingering damage and celebrate their victory. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the town could finally breathe. But Ryan Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Blake Carson had been arrested, but he wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat easily. Ryan knew the Iron Fang's leader would find a way to retaliate, even from behind bars. His instincts proved correct when Nate Parker rushed into the youth center one afternoon, his face pale and his words urgent. "Blake's out," Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan froze. "What do you mean he's out?" "The sheriff said they had enough to hold him." Nate shook his head. "One of his crew must have pulled strings. Rumor is they're regrouping. Blake's furious, and he's not going to play games this time. He wants to end this, for good." Ryan felt a chill run through him. The town had united to face the Iron Fangs once, but if Blake was back, he wouldn't just try to scare them. This time, he'd aim to destroy everything they'd built. That evening, Ryan met with Sheriff Reed, Maggie, and a few trusted community members at the diner. The atmosphere was tense, the usual hum of the diner replaced with quiet murmurs and worried glances. "We can't let Blake take back control," Ryan said, his voice firm. "If we don't act, he'll come after the youth center again, or worse." Sheriff Reed nodded, his brow furrowed. "I've already got deputies watching his usual haunts, but Blake's slippery. If he's out for revenge, he'll be careful." "What about the rest of his crew?" Maggie asked. "Most of them are still locked up," the sheriff replied. "But Blake's got enough loyalists to make trouble. We need to figure out what he's planning and shut it down before it starts." Nate leaned forward, his expression grim. "Blake's not going to hit the youth center again. That'd be too predictable. He'll want something bigger, something that'll send a message to the whole town." The table fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Ryan broke the quiet. "Then we don't wait for him to strike. We take the fight to him." Maggie's eyes widened. "Ryan, are you serious? That's dangerous." "I'm not saying we fight him head-on," Ryan clarified. But if we can figure out where he's regrouping and what he's planning, we can stop it before it starts. Sheriff Reed sighed. It's risky, but it's the best shot we've got. Nate, you still know where Blake might go? There's an old warehouse on the edge of town, Nate said. Blake used it as a meeting spot before. If he's back, that's where he'll be. Later that night, Ryan, Sheriff Reed, and Nate drove to the warehouse in an unmarked vehicle, parking a safe distance away. The building loomed in the moonlight, its rusted exterior a reminder of its long-abandoned state. Through binoculars, Ryan spotted movement inside. Shadows flickered against the cracked windows, and faint voices carried through the still night air. "They're in there," Nate whispered. Sheriff Reed reached for his radio. "I'll call for backup. We'll need to surround the place." Ryan placed a hand on the sheriff's arm. "If they see cops, they'll scatter. Let me go in first. I can get close without them noticing." "No way," the sheriff said firmly. "You've done enough, Ryan. This is a job for law enforcement." "I'm not going to fight them," Ryan said. "I just want to find out what they're planning. If we know their next move, we can stop them without anyone getting hurt." After a long pause, the sheriff relented. "All right, but the second you see anything dangerous, you get out of there. Understood?" Ryan nodded and slipped out of the car, his heart pounding as he approached the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Blake Carson stood in the center of the room, his voice a low growl as he addressed the few remaining members of his crew. "We've been humiliated," Blake snarled. "That kid and this town think they've won, but they haven't seen what we're capable of." Ryan crouched behind a stack of crates, listening intently. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Blake continued. "The diner, the community center, even their homes if we have to. They need to know that no one crosses the Iron Fangs and gets away with it." Ryan's chest tightened. Blake wasn't just planning an attack. He was planning an all-out assault on the town. Suddenly, one of the gang members glanced toward the crates. "What was that?" he said, reaching for his flashlight. Ryan froze as the beam of light swept toward him. Before he could move, Nate's voice rang out from outside the warehouse. "Blake, it's me." The gang turned toward the entrance, where Nate stood with his hands raised. Ryan took the distraction as an opportunity to slip out of the building, his mind racing with the information he'd overheard. Back at the car, Ryan relayed everything to Sheriff Reed, who immediately called for reinforcements. Within minutes, patrol cars surrounded the warehouse, their red and blue lights cutting through the night. Blake and his crew tried to escape, but there was nowhere to run. Deputies moved in, arresting them one by one. Blake fought back, but it was clear his gang was finished. As the last of the Iron Fangs were loaded into patrol cars, Blake turned to Ryan, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think this is over," he spat. "You'll never get rid of me." Ryan met his gaze, calm and resolute. "You're wrong, Blake. This town doesn't belong to you. It never did." By dawn, the warehouse was empty, and the Iron Fangs were back in custody. Ryan returned to the youth center, exhausted but relieved. Maggie was waiting for him, her arms crossed but her face soft with concern. "You're insane," she said, but there was a small smile on her lips. Ryan chuckled. "Probably, but it's over now." "For now," she said, stepping closer. "You know there'll always be people like Blake, people who think they can take whatever they want." "Yeah," Ryan said, "but there'll always be people like us too, people who stand up to them." As the first rays of sunlight lit up the town, Ryan realized that while the fight had been long and difficult, it had been worth it. Riverbend was stronger, more united, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks following the final confrontation with Blake Carson and the Iron Fangs brought a transformation to Riverbend. The gang's collapse left a void, but instead of fear or chaos, the town filled it with hope. The youth center, once a struggling community resource, had become a beacon of resilience and unity. Ryan Matthews stood in the center's courtyard, watching as a group of kids played basketball while others worked on repairing old bikes. The laughter and chatter filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once gripped the town. Ryan felt a deep sense of pride, but also a strange detachment. Despite the overwhelming support from the community, he often found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. One afternoon, As Ryan was organizing supplies in the storage room, Mrs. Avery approached him with a warm smile. "Ryan, you've got a visitor." Ryan wiped his hands on a rag and followed her to the main hall. Standing there was Travis Parker, Nate's 10-year-old son. Nate stood behind him, his expression a mix of pride and nervousness. "I thought it was time Travis got involved in something positive," Nate said. "Maybe you could teach him a few of those self-defense moves." Ryan crouched down to Travis's level, his voice gentle. "You like basketball or bikes?" Travis hesitated, then pointed to the bikes. "Bikes." Ryan grinned. "Good choice. Let's get started." Over the next hour, Ryan worked with Travis, teaching him how to fix a loose chain and check the brakes. Nate watched from a distance, his face softening as he saw his son laughing and engaging with the other kids. The youth center became a hub of activity in the following months. Local businesses offered sponsorships, veterans volunteered their time, and even neighboring towns sent donations. Ryan found himself busier than ever, but he didn't mind. For the first time, he felt like he was truly making a difference. One evening, as the sun set over Riverbend, Ryan sat on the diner's porch with Maggie. The two of them had fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing quiet moments between the busyness of the youth center and school. "You ever think about what's next?" Maggie asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Ryan leaned back, his gaze on the horizon. "Sometimes. But I think what's next is here. There's so much we can still do for the town, for the center." Maggie smiled. "You've done more than enough already, Ryan. You gave this town its courage back." Ryan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. And it's not about me. It's about everyone stepping up, together." Maggie nudged his arm playfully. "You're allowed to take some credit, you know." Ryan smiled, but his mind drifted to his father. He wondered what his dad would think of everything that had happened. Would he be proud? Would he have stood up the same way? Ryan didn't know for sure, but he hoped so. The biggest moment for the youth center came in the form of a town-wide celebration. Mrs. Avery had suggested hosting an open house to showcase everything the center had accomplished. Ryan had been hesitant at first. He didn't love being the center of attention, but he eventually agreed. On the day of the event, the youth center was packed. Families toured the newly renovated spaces, kids showed off their self-defense skills, and a local band played music in the courtyard. Maggie had set up a photo booth, and Sheriff Reed even grilled burgers for the crowd. Toward the end of the event, Mrs. Avery called Ryan to the stage. He stood there, nervously rubbing the back of his neck as the crowd cheered. "I'm not great at speeches," he began, earning a few laughs. "But I just want to say thank you. Not just for supporting the youth center, but for standing up for each other. For believing in something bigger than fear." He paused, his voice softening. "This place isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about the kids finding a safe space, the volunteers who give their time, and the families who show up to help. That's what makes Riverbend strong." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ryan stepped off the stage, his cheeks red. Maggie met him at the bottom of the steps, grinning. "Not bad for someone who hates speeches," she teased. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Riverbend became more apparent. The youth center expanded its programs, offering mentorship, tutoring, and even job training. The diner became a community hub, where people gathered to share stories and plan events. Blake Carson and his gang faded into memory, their downfall serving as a reminder of what the town had overcome. Sheriff Reed continued to keep a watchful eye, but the sense of fear that had once plagued Riverbend was gone. Ryan, though still a teenager, had become a symbol of hope. People looked to him for guidance, and he embraced the role reluctantly but with quiet determination. He continued teaching self-defense classes and mentoring kids like Travis, finding fulfillment in the small, everyday victories. One afternoon, Ryan stood on the basketball court, watching as Tim and the other kids played a lively game. Nate approached him, carrying a clipboard. "We're starting that bike repair program next week," Nate said. "You ready to lead it?" Ryan grinned. "You're leading it, Nate. I'll just supervise." Nate laughed. "Fair enough." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The fight that had started with a single stand at the diner had grown into something so much bigger. It had changed him, the youth center, and the entire town. For the first time in months, Ryan allowed himself to breathe. The battles weren't over. There would always be challenges, but for now, Riverbend stood united, stronger than ever. And Ryan Matthews was right where he needed to be.